And this thing is really something else. Oh goodness. I'm trying to get that thing. Brother Wood, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can hear you, sir.
There is something on my screen that is preventing me from sharing this thing, even though I have clicked on it.
Okay.
Are you able to share it from your end?
Yes, sir. I can share it, but I do not have the material on this computer, sir.
Oh, okay. I don't know why this thing is blocking me. There's something blocking me right here at the side.
Oh. Well, sir, you can email the material to the Jamaica School of Teaching, and then I will be able to find it and share it, sir.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, Brother Wood, it's on its way to the Jamaica School of Preaching. Gmail.
Okay, sir. I will check it now, sir. I received it, sir. All right.
All right, so you can put on test number 3 first. After that, we'll look at test number 2.
Okay, sir. Can you see the screenshot?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Okay, sir.
I think you need to click on Enable Editing in order for it to move from one screen to the other.
Yes, sir. It can move, sir. We can move it, sir.
Or click on the top right-hand corner that says Enable Editing, and that will solve the problem.
Okay, sir. Oh. All right, sir. It's okay now.
Okay, and so you can go right back to the beginning. Good.
Yes, sir.
All right, before I begin, let us go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we give you thanks that you enabled us to get over this obstacle. We pray that you may bless our review session. Help us, dear Father, to be able to prepare ourselves well for the end of your exams. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, someone is trying to get in. Do you see the person?
Yes, sir.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Sister Hooper. Good morning. Okay, so I'm going to take the register at this time. So as I call your name, I'd like you to let me know that you're present. Okay. Solin?
Present, sir.
Good. And Wood is here.
Yes, sir.
Richard, are you here? Richard, brother, what do you see Richard Roy there?
No, sir. He's not.
All right, okay. And Sister Hooper is here.
Yes.
All right, good. All right, thank you very much. So when I ask you, Brother Wood, to change your screen, you can just change it for me, okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so today we're going to be revising test number 3, which you did last week, based on lesson number 13, entitled Do Similarities Between Human Embryos and Animal Embryos Mean One Common Ancestor or One and the Same Designer? And we will look at the section that deals with the discussion of this test. All right, let us go to the next screen at this time. Thank you. Next screen now. All right. So the first question was, explain how Ernst Haeckel in the late 1860s deceived the world into thinking that all living things descended from one common ancestor. Well, here would be a good answer. He made false drawings of embryos of animals and a human being, which made them look very similar. He used this as evidence that both animals and human beings descended from one common ancestor, the fish. Now, if you look at the first line or the first row of embryos, This is a fish embryo, and that is a salamander embryo. I think that is a type of lizard. This is a turtle embryo. Over here is a bird embryo. This is a rabbit embryo, and this is a human embryo. Now notice that they have a similar shaped head. They have some gill slits, as they call them, in each one of them.
Morning, sir.
Yes, good morning, Richard. And they have a tail. All of them have a tail, and they look so much alike. Well, these misrepresented what the embryos actually look like in this beginning stage in the embryo. This is a deliberate deception. Ernst Haeckel knew enough about the study of embryos to know that this is not how they actually look. And of course, the similarities continue, but to a less extent in the second row. Here you have the fish embryo at the mid stage of development, the salamander, you have the turtle, the bird, the rabbit, and the human. And what they have in common still are the gill slits and the tail. Each one of them looks like they have a tail. Then the third row is the last stage of embryonic development. Here is the fish. Here is the salamander. Here is the turtle. This is the bird. This is the rabbit. And this is the human. So he made them look so much alike. And what he wanted to prove is that both animals and human beings descended from one common ancestor, which is the fish. Evolutionists believe that the first kind of life was the fish in the sea, and that the fish developed legs. The fins turned into legs, and they were able to walk out of the sea onto the dry land and learn to breathe the air into lungs. And that these were called amphibians. And the amphibians developed into reptiles like lizards. Salamander is a type of lizard. And one of the kinds of lizards is the dinosaur, which means terrible lizard. And that the reptiles developed into birds. So here's the bird. They developed feathers and were able to fly, and that the birds developed into mammals like rabbits, and the mammals developed into humans. But they say that everything that has life descended from the fish, that the fish was the first ancestor. Okay, so the drawing of the different embryos was meant to deceive the world into thinking that the embryos of humans and animals all look alike and they resemble the fish, and that therefore means that we all have descended from the fish. Okay, so these were false drawings. Okay, let us look at the next slide.
Brother.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Yes,
so
I'm listening,
it was
Mr. Hooper.
okay. So it was not other evolutionists, but Haeckel himself who distorted the drawings, and then would he have gotten other evolutionists to agree with him?
Oh, they readily agreed with him.
Okay,
What I learned
okay.
about evolutionists is if they can deceive the world into accepting some evidence of evolution having had taken place in the past, they would go along with that. And even to this day, they still are insisting that Haeckel was right, even though he was wrong. Okay, so yes, the evolutionists try to hold on to a fraudulent piece of evidence as long as they can. This is not the
So,
only case of fraud in the
Mhm.
history of evolution.
So then in the answer, one should have emphasized um, the how Haeckel deliberately set out to mislead. Should that
That's
have been?
correct.
Okay, okay then. Thank you.
That is correct.
Thank you.
And to do that, he did not draw the embryos correctly.
Right,
He
right.
made the first row of embryos to look alike. Now, the next one, let us look at the next slide now. Okay, so the next question, I'm going to show you now that the picture at the bottom is really different from the picture in the previous slide. Okay, this whole picture is a contrast between what Ernst Haeckel drew and what the other scientists who studied embryos revealed to the public, that how different his embryos were from what they actually look like. So let's look at the question. Question number 2 is, show how other scientists were able to prove that Ernst Haeckel had not proven that all living things descended from one common ancestor. Now, this is not really a contradiction to what I said a while ago. You do have some honest scientists out there, and in their particular field of expertise, they would not feel good that some other scientist is misrepresenting the facts. So even if they agree with evolution, not all evolutionary scientists would go along with fraud. Unfortunately, the majority of them would go along with it, but you would have some honest scientists out there that would not be comfortable with fraud. So show how other scientists at the time, in the time when Ernst Haeckel lived, were able to prove that Ernst Haeckel had not proven that all living things descended from one common ancestor. Okay, now I put the picture here. I'm not expecting you in a test or in an exam to draw pictures, but I just put it here so you can understand better the answer. In the first row of prints, which is this row right here, of a fish embryo, a salamander embryo, a turtle embryo, a chicken embryo, a rabbit embryo, and a human embryo, Ernst Haeckel made them look almost the same, as I pointed out in the previous slide. In the second row of prints of the same embryos, fish embryo, salamander embryo, turtle embryo, chicken embryo, rabbit embryo, and human embryo, other scientists who specialized in the study of embryos, that would be called embryology, showed how these embryos are different from each other. Now notice how this embryo doesn't look like this one up on the first row. This salamander embryo, look how different it looks from the salamander embryo drawn in the first row. Now this turtle embryo almost looks the same as this one. Okay, but it's still not altogether the same. The chicken embryo here that Ernst Haeckel drew, notice how the other scientists who disagreed with him drew the chicken embryo, different from how Ernst Haeckel drew it. And this rabbit embryo, look how different it looks here from how it is drawn up there. and the human embryo, look how very much different it looks from the human embryo drawn here. And look how very different it looks from the fish embryo. Look how the turtle embryo, the salamander embryo, looks different from the fish embryo. And the turtle embryo looks different from the fish. And the chicken looks different from the fish. And the rabbit looks different from the fish. And the human looks different from the fish. So they showed how these embryos are different from each other. Okay, let us move on to the next slide. Okay, number 3, demonstrate from Genesis chapter 1 why Ernst Haeckel's view that all living things descended from one common ancestor is false. Well, Genesis chapter 1 teaches that God created vegetative life separately from living creatures that fly in the sky, as illustrated here. The vegetation was created first, and then we find on another day, the flying creatures were created and the water creatures. So creatures that fly in the sky and that swim in the waters were created separately from the vegetative life. And land animals, represented by this chimpanzee and this lion, were created separately from human life. So each kind of life was created separately. And it is not said in Genesis that one kind of life eventually evolved into another kind, but that each kind was created separately from the other kind. So Genesis chapter 1 does not teach that life began in water and evolved into land animals and humans. Each form of life was created to reproduce after their own kind, not to evolve into a different kind of life. Therefore, similarity of some embryos does not prove that all living things evolved from one ancestor, but it proves that all living things, including humans, were created by one and the same design and creator God. So there are 2 points: that each kind of life was created separately from other kinds of life, and each kind of life was made to reproduce after their own kind, not to evolve into a different kind of life. Let's go on now to the next slide. Number 4, explain why gill slits and tailbone in human embryos do not prove that all living things descended from one common ancestor. Well, gill slits, and I've put it in quotation marks because they're not actually gill slits. Gill slits are not proof that human beings descended from fish in water. These so-called gill slits later develop into the thymus gland in the neck, which helps to fight germs as the embryo develops in the womb. And the thymus gland in turn later develops into the parathyroid glands in the neck as the embryo continues to develop, which helps to keep calcium at the right level in the body. And the parathyroid glands in the neck later develop into the middle ear to help in hearing sounds. And one thing that the gill slits are never used for is that they're never used to take oxygen from the amniotic fluid, which is the fluid around the embryo in the womb. But the umbilical cord, which is attached to the stomach, the umbilical cord brings air into the body of the embryo. So the name gill slits is only there because of the influence of evolution. And you will find it in biology textbooks because of the assumption that that evolution really happened. But they're not really gills like what we have in fish that open and shut to take oxygen from the river water or the lake water or the sea water or the ocean water. What about tails? Tails are not proof that human beings descended from the ancestor of the apes and humans. What looks like a tail in the human embryo is the end part of the developing backbone. Eventually, what looks like a tail is going to disappear because it all is going to form into the backbone in the developing baby, till there is no sign of anything looking like a tail. So what looks like a tail in the human embryo is the end part of the developing backbone. The information in the genes of human embryos does not have any instructions for the formation of a tail, as the information in the genes of the ape embryos have. It is this information in the genes which keeps one kind of life different from other kinds of life, and which prevents one kind of life from changing into a completely different kind of life. Brother Wood, you can change it. Thank you. Number 5, why is it that not all evolutionists have abandoned Ernst Haeckel's proof that all living things descended from one common ancestor? And the answer is, not all evolutionists have abandoned Ernst Haeckel's proof of evolution from comparisons of the human and animal embryos. They say that other scientists, and by that I mean other scientists living in the days of Ernst Haeckel, who specialized in the study of embryos, were enemies of Haeckel. Now, there is no proof of that. Just because somebody disagrees with me or disagrees with you over an interpretation of information in our field of study does not therefore mean that they hate you or that you hate them. Disagreement in and of itself does not mean that people are hostile towards each other. So they have not proven that these scientists who lived in the days of Haeckel and who disagreed with him were enemies. And they also claim that they alleged, these scientists alleged. Now, when you say that somebody alleged, it is different from saying that they proved. Allege means that you claim that something is so, but you have not proven that it is so. So they have not accepted the proof. They call it alleged, but did not prove that his print of embryos was fraudulent, and that scientists today who believe that God created everything, you do have those scientists around. Scientists today who believe that God created everything have used what Haeckel's enemies said about him in the past to prove that Haeckel's comparisons of human and animal embryos were false. Well, you know, there's a simple method to know one way or the other who is telling the truth. People who study embryology today, all they need to do to prove one way or the other whether Haeckel was right or wrong is to look at the different embryos of animals and humans and see if they look like what Haeckel drew them back in the 19th century AD. That's all that is needed. We don't have to speculate or guess. But another reason why evolutionists have not all abandoned Ernst Haeckel's proof that all living things descended from one common ancestor, namely the fish, is this one. Evolutionists also have an agenda. And by an agenda, I mean they have a campaign going on. They have something to try to get done in the education system. And that is to try to convince students in the education system, not just in one country, but throughout the world, that there is no God and that evolution is the cause of everything in the universe coming into existence. This is why they're slow to give up evolutionary evidence that is proven to be false. Okay, now Brother Wood, you can get the other one, and that is the discussion of test number 2, when we were looking at the chimpanzee and the human body parts and DNA. The reason I'm asking Brother Wood to share the screen is that there is a certain item on my laptop that is blocking me from sharing. And I've tried to get rid of it from even before chapel this morning, and I can't get it away. So I'm glad that Brother Wood can get around this problem. So he's about to share with us the discussion of test number 2. And the reason I'm putting these two together is that they're dealing with a similar issue. So this one says how to answer a test and how to prepare for a test or an exam. We will not look at everything, but I will deal specifically with the review of test 2, similar body parts and DNA. Do not prove one common ancestor, but one common designer and creator. Okay, let us move on to the next slide. Okay, question number 1. What proof do evolutionists give that apes and humans are cousins? And as I pointed out some time before, the red print means I'm giving you some advice on how to answer a question in a test or an exam that will cause you to get complete marks for that answer. Make sure that you give as complete an answer as possible. Do not leave out any possible part of the answer. If you do, you will at best only get half of the total percentage for that question. Now for the answer itself. One of the often used arguments by evolutionists to try to prove that all living things evolved from one and the same ancestor is the similarity of body parts and of DNA. For example, an ape has 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 nose, 1 mouth, teeth, 1 tongue, 2 hands, 2 feet, and a human being has 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 nose, 1 mouth, teeth, 1 tongue, 2 hands, and 2 feet. Now, I think all of you put down that answer. Some left out this part of the answer, and that is they go further than this by claiming that an ape's DNA and a human being's DNA have 98% similarity. Indeed, some evolutionists say they have 100% similarity. That is how anxious they are to prove that we are all related, and claim that this proves that apes and humans are cousins and that we share one and the same ancestor. So those are the proofs. Okay, so proof 1 is that we have similar body parts. And proof number 2 is that the DNA is highly similar, just a 2% difference. Okay, so that is the customary answer that the proof that they give. Now, question number 2, the next slide. Why may we trust the Bible's explanation about how different kinds of life began? Well, here is advice again. The red print is advice on how to answer the test question. One of the important words in the question is why. This means that you need to give reasons. We may trust the Bible's explanation about how different kinds of life began. Another important word in the question is trust. To support the Bible explains about how different kinds of life began. So the answer begins itself. The Holy Scriptures is given by inspiration of God. That is, God spoke to writers whom he had personally chosen and told them to write down what he told them. Therefore, when we read about the creation in the book of Genesis, we're not reading Moses' beliefs about what happened in the beginning, but we're reading what God told Moses that he did in the beginning. Okay, however, the answer is not finished, so I'm giving you more advice. You have written that the Holy Scriptures is given by inspiration of God. You have explained what inspiration of God means. However, what are proofs that the Holy Scriptures is given by inspiration of God? So the answer to that part of the question is the proofs that the Holy Scriptures is given by inspiration of God are that prophecies have been fulfilled, there is scientific foreknowledge, laws governing human behavior are different from what human beings would have written by their own reasoning and desires. There are one and the same teachings taught by over 40 different authors over a period of 1,600 years. That in itself is a great surprise, because even in our present day, if you were to listen to a talk show on the radio, you will find that people disagree over everything. They disagree, even though they're living in the same period of time, even though they may go to the same school or the same university, even though they may have the same level of education. They disagree over everything. How can you get over 40 different authors over a period not only of the present, but over a period of 1,600 years, agreeing on these different teachings that are in the Bible? And therefore, God actually spoke to all of these writers, giving them knowledge that they could not have had on their own. So that's how to answer that question. Why may we trust the Bible's explanation about how different kinds of life began? Let us now move on to number 3. Question number 3. Prove from the Bible that all living things have one and the same creator, and that all living things did not descend and evolve from one common ancestor. Now, here is some advice on how to answer the question. There are 2 main points in answering the question. 1, God made each kind of life separately from other kinds of life. And 2, each kind of life was commanded to reproduce after their own kind, not evolve into a different kind of life. This question is not answered correctly by simply writing 1 or 2 of the kinds of life that God created on the 3rd day, on the 5th day, and on the 6th day. Write all the kinds of life for each of the days, and also show that God created each kind of life separately from each other kinds of life. then write that each kind of life was to reproduce its own kind of life, not evolve into a new kind of life. Now for the answer itself. God said to Moses that he created vegetative life on the third day of creation week, and that each kind of vegetative life was to reproduce after its kind, not change from vegetative life to animal life, and then to human life. Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 to 12. God said to Moses that he created all kinds of flying creatures and water creatures on the fifth day of creation week, and that each kind of flying and water creature which have life was to reproduce after its kind, not change from their kind to animals on land that walk or creep, and then to change further to human life. Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 to 21. Note well, I'm pausing on this point because this is something you really need to remember. Evolutionists believe that human life evolved from fish life, but God said that fishes were created separately from human life, and that fishes were to reproduce only fish, but not evolve from fish life to human life. Let us move on. And this is a continuation of the answer to question 3. God said to Moses that he created land animals which walk or creep on the land on the sixth day of creation week. This would have included the apes. Each kind of land animal was to reproduce after its own kind, but not change from their kind into human life. Genesis chapter 1, verse 24. Later on the same sixth day of creation week, God said to Moses that he created man and woman in his image and likeness. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27. Therefore, all living things have the one and the same creator. They did not evolve from one and the same ancestor. Question number 4. Prove that the DNA similarity between chimps and humans is not as close as was once thought. And in answering, first of all, I give some advice in the red print. It does not help to say that DNA in chimps and in humans is 98% similar, because this is the very point that you're trying to disprove. That is, it is not as close as was once thought. The answer itself now is early studies in the 1970s, based on a small fraction of the genetic code, led to claims of 98% similarity. With the chimp DNA now completely decoded, the similarity, when all the DNA is included, is not more than 87%, and arguably below 70%. So the answer simply is 98% is no longer accurate. That was what scientists said in the 1970s when they started to try to decipher or to decode or to translate the genetic code in different living things. And now that they have decoded the human genetic code and the chimpanzee genetic code completely and have made the comparison, they now realize that the similarity is not as high as 98%. The maximum it could be is 87%. And it could be argued that it is below 70%. Okay, now question number 5. Even if chimp and human DNA were 98% similar, prove that there would still be a vast difference between chimps and humans. Now, in the red print, this is my advice on how to answer a question like this. Do not confuse 1,500-page books. This is the total information in the human DNA. The question is not asking for the total information in the human DNA, but it is asking for what is 2% of this total information. You may wonder, why am I dealing with 2%? Well, if there is 98% similarity, it means that there is a 2% of information that is not similar. And that is what I'm focusing on in answering this question. 2% of the 1,500-page books is 20 500-page books, and that's still a lot of information. You know, it takes quite a while to read 500 pages in a book. I did that recently, and it took me about 3 weeks to read through a 500-page book. Actually, I was reading different pages from different books, but it amounted to 501 pages. It took me about 3 weeks and spending hours each day doing the same thing. It's not easy to read through even one 500-page book. And then 2,500-page books, that's a lot of information. That's a lot of information that sets us apart from the chimpanzee, even though it's 2%. So you use this to show that even if there were only 2% difference between human DNA and chimp DNA, it would still mean that the chimp does not have a lot of information that is in the 2% of the human DNA. All right, so the answer itself is this. The DNA in humans has an amount of information equal to 1,500-page books. Therefore, even a 2% difference is equal to 2,500-page books of information. Now, here's advice again. After writing this, you may go on to state some obvious differences between chimps and humans, such as which chimp has been able to go to school, university, teach a class, speak English or French or Spanish, make a scientific breakthrough like human beings have been doing. It just goes to show that there is a lot of intelligence that humans have which chimpanzees do not have, and which sets us apart further from the chimpanzee. So though we are similar, we're not as similar as was thought in the 1970s. And even a 2% difference makes a whole lot of difference between ourselves and the chimpanzees. Okay, now God permitting, okay, let me read this section. How to prepare for a test or exam. You know that there's only one teaching week next week. And after next week, there's going to be the exam week. So this is relevant. How to prepare for a test or exam. Read the specific objectives of the lesson or lessons that you're going to be tested on. They state what you will have been able to do when the lesson has been taught. Number 2, with these specific objectives in mind, then study the lesson carefully, a section at a time, and go back to the specific objective that has been answered by the section that you have just finished studying, and see if you can answer the specific objective. Number 3, do the same with each section. Study the particular section, and then go back to the specific objective for this section and see if you can answer the specific objective. Okay, now that's all we're going to be looking at in our revision for this week. Lord willing, next week we will look at lesson 11, which deals with the worldwide flood of Noah, explains the fossil record. You see, the fossil record has long been used by evolutionists as a history of the origin and development of life. But when you realize that all of these dead creatures that have turned into rock in the sedimentary rocks around the world were living at the same period of time in the days of Noah, then you have a different view of that fossil record. It is not a history of the origin and development of life, but it really is a history of what happened to all living creatures in the days of Noah when they were destroyed by a worldwide flood. So it doesn't prove any origin of life and development of life from the simplest form to the most complicated form. But it shows that all of them in their varieties were already present in their different kinds. They were already there in the days of Noah, and they got buried in different layers of sand, mud, gravel, which hardened into rock because of the high mineral content in the water. Okay, so it's a different way of explaining it from the evolutionists. That's why the evolutionists tried to say that the worldwide flood in Noah was a myth. It didn't actually happen. And they do not believe in a rapid burial and a rapid fossilization or turning into rock of these dead things. Okay, so we'll be looking at that next week, God willing, and that will be the end of our revision. Just want you to know that maybe you should already have started revising lessons 11, 12, and 13 on your own, which are the lessons we covered this trimester. Lesson 11 is the worldwide flood in Noah's day, is a better explanation of the fossil record than the evolutionary interpretation. Lesson 12 is about the similarities of the body parts and the DNA of chimpanzees and humans, and evolutionists trying to show that it means we are cousins or relatives of the chimpanzee, and how to object to it, how to show it's not so. And lesson 13 is about the similarities of embryos of animals and humans, and evolutionists using this similarity to prove that we all descended from the same ancestor, the fish. Okay, so those are the three lessons. So you should already have started revising. So next week, we will look at lesson 11 by itself. And thank you, Brother Wood, for being the one to share the screen.
Yes, sir. You're welcome, sir.
Because if you didn't do that, I would not have been able to share the information today. So thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, God willing, I'll see you later. Take care.